172 children. 10 feet to open air. 0 fire drills in 7 years. March 4, 1908, Collinwood, Ohio, a small village east of Cleveland near the shore of Lake Erie. On this Wednesday morning, the air was cold. Late winter in northeastern Ohio, overcast, raw, the kind of gray that sits against your skin. Breath hanging visible in the pale light. Frost still clinging to fence posts and windowsills. 325 children walked into their school that morning. They stamped the cold off their boots. They hung their coats on hooks in the hallway. They took their seats. The building was warm. The furnace in the basement was running. And the day began the way every other day had begun, quietly, routinely, without a single reason for concern. What no one in Collinwood understood that morning, not the teachers, not the parents, not the principal who greeted them at the door, is that what would happen in the next 90 minutes would not be decided by fire. It would be decided by a door. A single architectural choice, the direction a door swings, would determine whether 300 children walked out alive or whether 172 of them died in a space smaller than a bedroom, close enough to the outside air to feel it on their faces, close enough to reach out and touch it, and unable to get through. This is not the story of a school that burned down. This is the story of a building that was designed without malice, without awareness, without anyone ever stopping to ask the question, to kill the children inside it the moment anything went wrong. By minute 10, you'll understand every design choice that turned Lakeview Elementary into a trap. By minute 18, you'll see the exact moment when escape became physically impossible, and why the children who survived were the ones who broke the rules. And by the end, you'll know why every push-bar door you've ever pressed to exit a building exists, because of what happened in Collinwood on a Wednesday morning in March. But first, you need to understand the world that built that school, and why no one saw it for what it was. By the early 1900s, fire was killing Americans with a regularity that is difficult to comprehend today. Tenements in New York, factories across the industrial Midwest, theaters, hotels, department stores. The country was building faster than it was learning, faster than it was thinking. Wood frame structures went up in weeks. Fire codes, where they existed at all, were local, inconsistent, and rarely enforced. A building could open its doors to the public without anyone ever having asked the most basic question about it. What happens when something goes wrong inside? And the problem wasn't that Americans didn't know fire was dangerous. Every family in the country knew that. The problem was subtler. The problem was that the buildings they lived in, worked in, shopped in, and gathered inside had never been designed for the moment when fire arrived. They were designed for the good day, the normal day, the day when everyone walks in through the front door and walks out through the front door, one at a time, in orderly fashion. No one designed for the day when everyone tries to leave at the same time. And then came December 30th, 1903, a date that should have changed everything. What happened that day would kill 602 people in a single building, in a single afternoon. It should have been the last warning America ever needed. It wasn't. The Iroquois Theater in Chicago was brand new. It had been open for 5 weeks. It had been advertised with confidence, with pride, as fireproof. The word was printed in the programs. It was spoken by the management. Fireproof, the safest theater in the city. On December 30th, 1903, during a packed matinee performance, an audience of mostly women and children, a holiday crowd filling over 1,600 seats, a stage light ignited a muslin curtain. The flame caught. The curtain climbed. Within minutes, the auditorium filled with superheated air and thick, black, toxic smoke that rolled across the ceiling and descended on the crowd like a wave. The audience rushed for the exits. And this is where they died. The doors, the main exit doors of the Iroquois Theater, opened inward. In normal operation, that was fine. You walk up to a door, you pull it toward you, you step through. Simple, ordinary. A choice no one had reason to question on any day but the worst one. But on the worst day, with 1,000 people pressing forward at once, the doors could not be pulled open. There was no room. The bodies behind pressed the bodies in front flat against the doors, arms pinned, handles unreachable. The doors required space to swing inward, and there was no space left. It was filled with people. The bodies piled up in the lobbies and vestibules. Fire escapes outside were incomplete, ladders that ended in midair, platforms that went nowhere. Emergency exits were bolted shut from the outside because management had been concerned about people sneaking in without tickets. 602 people died. Most of them did not burn. They were crushed. They suffocated. They died because they could not get through a door that would have opened freely if it had swung the other direction. The Iroquois Theater fire became the deadliest single-building fire in American history. It produced national outrage. Cities across the country passed new fire codes for theaters and places of public assembly. Outward opening doors were mandated in performance venues. Fire escapes were required on entertainment buildings. Inspections were ordered. The lesson was learned. For theaters. It was not learned for schools. 5 years after the Iroquois Theater, 5 years after 600 people died because of inward opening doors, a school in Ohio would kill 172 children for exactly the same reason. The technology to save them already existed. The knowledge was there. The engineering had been done. Why wasn't it applied? The answer tells you everything about how societies decide whose safety matters and whose can wait. Schools occupied a unique category in the American mind. They were not theaters, places of entertainment, of crowds, of potential vice. They were not factories, places of known danger and industrial hazard where men lost fingers and limbs. They were not tenements, buildings associated with poverty and overcrowding, where families packed into rooms like cargo. Schools were different. Schools were community buildings, safe places, symbols of civic progress. The buildings where you sent your children every morning without a second thought, because why would you think about it? Why would you worry? The building was brick. It was solid. It was permanent. It was maintained by good people. It was where the children went. Fire escapes were for dangerous buildings. Fire drills were for buildings where you expected trouble. Schools were not those buildings. Schools were the places where trouble didn't happen. This was the assumption. It was shared by parents, by school boards, by village councils, by state legislatures who wrote fire codes for theaters and forgot to write them for schools. It was shared by everyone. And it was the assumption that killed 172 children. Collinwood, Ohio in 1908 was a village of about 8,000 people, a railroad town, working class, modest homes on modest streets, immigrant families, Slovenian, Italian, Irish, German, who had crossed oceans and settled in the flatlands east of Cleveland to build something for their children, something stable, something permanent, something better than what they'd left behind. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the butcher knew your name and the grocer knew your children, where the school was the center of civic life, not just a building, but a gathering point, a source of pride, the physical proof that this village was a real community with a real future. Children walked to school in groups because their families lived within blocks of the building. brothers and sisters together, neighbors' children together. The walk was short. The route was familiar. The building was always there. Lakeview Elementary was the village's school. Built in 1901, 3 stories, brick exterior, handsome enough for a small community to take pride in. It served children from about age 6 to 14, the full range of elementary education, from the youngest who were just learning their letters to the oldest who would soon leave school to work. The principal was Catherine Weiler, sometimes spelled Catherine in the records, a dedicated, respected educator. The kind of principal who knew every child's name, who knew most of their parents, who believed in the school and in the village it served. The janitor was Fritz Herder, a working man. He tended the building, stoked the furnace, kept the floors clean, kept the boiler running in winter. The building was his charge. 325 children attended. They entered through the front door every morning. They left through the front door every afternoon, every day for 7 years. No one ever questioned that routine. No one ever asked what would happen if they couldn't. Lakeview Elementary was built in 1901, and from the outside, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be: a solid, respectable community school. Brick walls, 3 stories tall, rows of windows that caught the light. A building you could stand in front of and feel that your village was doing right by its children. But here is where the story of March 4th, 1908 actually begins. Not with fire, not with panic, not with that cold Wednesday morning. It begins 7 years earlier, with the decisions made when this building was designed and constructed. Because every single choice that killed those children was made before the first student ever walked through the door. Made quietly, made routinely, made by people who were following standard practice, made by people who never imagined, not for a single moment, that they were building a death trap. There were 6 decisions. Each one on its own was unremarkable, standard practice. The way things were done, the way every school in Ohio was built, but stacked together, stacked on top of each other inside a single building filled with 300 children, they formed something no one intended and no one saw. A system engineered to produce the maximum number of casualties in the minimum amount of time. Let's take them one at a time. Decision 1. Wooden interior construction. The brick exterior was just a shell, a skin. Inside, everything was wood, wooden floors on every level, wooden stairways, wooden banisters, wooden trim and wainscoting on the walls. The building looked fireproof from the outside, solid brick, heavy and permanent, and burned like kindling on the inside. This was standard in 1901. Brick and wood together. Almost every school in Ohio was built the same way. The brick gave the impression of permanence. It gave the impression of safety. The wood made the interior affordable and easy to construct. Nobody questioned it. There was nothing to question. Its hidden cost: those brick walls didn't protect the interior from fire. They trapped the heat inside. Once a fire started within those walls, the building didn't just burn. It baked. The brick became the walls of an oven containing the heat, reflecting it inward, accelerating the combustion of everything within. Decision 2. A single primary staircase. The school had 3 floors of classrooms. All of them were served by one main central staircase that led down to the front entrance. There was a rear staircase, narrower, tucked away at the back of the building, but it was secondary, an afterthought, not the route anyone used, not the route anyone knew. Children came down the front stairs every morning. They went up the front stairs to their classrooms. They came down the front stairs at the end of the day. It was the way the building worked. One staircase, 325 children. In normal operation, that's perfectly fine. Children don't all leave at the same time. They move in classes. They take turns. The staircase handles the load because the load is distributed across the day. But in an emergency, when every child on every floor tries to descend at once, a single staircase becomes a funnel. And a funnel, when overfilled, becomes a plug. Decision 3, and this is the one that matters most: inward opening doors on the front vestibule. At the bottom of the main staircase was the front vestibule, a small enclosed space, approximately 8 feet wide, maybe 6 feet deep, that served as the transition between the interior hallway and the outside world. 2 sets of doors. The inner doors opened inward into the vestibule toward the children approaching them. The outer doors opened outward to the schoolyard and the street. In daily use, this worked perfectly. A child walks up to the inner door, pulls it toward them, steps into the vestibule, pushes the outer door, walks outside. Simple. Routine. Done 10,000 times without anyone noticing or caring which direction the doors swung, because it simply didn't matter. Until it did. Now imagine 300 panicked children pressing down the staircase behind you. Smoke rising from the hallway, screaming echoing off the walls. You reach the inner door. You grab the handle. You pull. But there is no room to pull. The bodies behind you, other children, children you know, children who sit next to you in class, are pressing you forward, flat against the door. Your arms are pinned against your sides. The door opens toward you, but you cannot step back to let it swing, because there is a wall of children behind you, pushing, and they cannot stop because there are more children behind them, pressing down the stairs, and they cannot stop because the hallway above them is filling with smoke, and everyone is screaming, and you can feel the door handle against your chest, and the outside air is right there, and you cannot move, and you cannot breathe, and the door will not open. The outside air is 10 feet away, and you cannot reach it. That is how a door becomes a weapon. Decision 4. No fire escapes. External fire escapes, metal staircases bolted to the outside of a building, were standard on tenements and factories across American cities by 1908. They were ugly, sometimes rusted, often complained about. But they worked. They allowed people to bypass a blocked interior stairway and descend directly to the ground from upper floors. They were the technology of second chances. Lakeview Elementary had none. No Ohio law required fire escapes on school buildings. The expense seemed unnecessary for a building that had never had a fire. And fire escapes carried a stigma. They were associated with tenements, with poverty, with buildings that were acknowledged to be dangerous. Schools were not those buildings. Schools were respectable. Without fire escapes, children on the second and third floors of Lakeview Elementary had exactly 2 options in an emergency. The interior staircase, which led directly to the vestibule and its inward opening doors, or the windows. Decision 5. No fire drills, not one, in 7 years. In the entire history of Lakeview Elementary, from the day it opened in 1901 to the morning of March 4, 1908, not a single fire drill was conducted. No teacher had a rehearsed evacuation plan. No child had ever practiced walking to an alternate exit. No administrator had ever timed how long it took 300 children to leave the building. No one had ever asked whether the building could empty safely in 5 minutes, or 10, or at all. Fire drills were not required by law. They were not common practice in schools. They disrupted instruction time, and the school had never had a fire. Why would you practice for something that had never happened? Why would you waste an afternoon walking children through a hypothetical? And so, when the fire came, every child in the building defaulted to the only route they knew. The front staircase, down to the front vestibule, out through the front door. Because they had never been shown anything else. Because no one had ever imagined they would need to know anything else. Decision 6. This was not fate. This was the absence of imagination. No one person made all 6 of these decisions. They were made by architects who followed standard blueprints, by a school board that approved a standard design, by a village council that funded a standard building, by a principal who inherited a standard facility, by a state legislature that never wrote a law requiring anything different. Each decision was made independently. Each was unremarkable. Each was identical to the decisions being made at hundreds of other schools across Ohio, across the Midwest, across the entire country. And that is what makes this story devastating. It wasn't negligence in the way we usually use that word. It wasn't someone cutting corners or ignoring a known danger. It was the simple, catastrophic failure to ask one question. What happens on the worst day? What happens when 300 children try to leave this building at the same time? What happens when they all go to the same staircase? What happens when they reach the vestibule and the doors won't open? No one asked, not the architect, not the school board, not Catherine Weiler, not a single parent who walked their child through those doors 1,000 times. For 7 years, no one asked. And then March 4th arrived, and the building answered. From 1901 to 1908, Lakeview Elementary operated without incident. 7 years of normal. Children arrived, children left. The furnace ran through the winters. The janitor swept the floors. The principal managed her school with competence and care. Report cards went home. Parents attended events. Holidays were celebrated. Classes were taught. The building was warm when it needed to be warm. The stairway echoed with the sound of children's shoes, that particular hollow, rhythmic clatter that anyone who has ever been inside a school recognizes. The vestibule doors swung open and closed 1,000 times a day, each time confirming what everyone believed. The building worked. The building was fine. The building had always been fine. And that is the nature of a latent disaster. It is invisible precisely because nothing has gone wrong yet. The inward opening doors function perfectly in peacetime. The single staircase handles the normal load without strain. The lack of fire escapes is irrelevant when there is no fire. The absence of fire drills causes no harm when there is nothing to evacuate from. Every normal day makes the dangerous design more invisible. Every uneventful year makes the absence of preparation seem more justified. Every morning that the children walk in and every afternoon that they walk out reinforces the belief that the building is safe, not because anyone has tested it, but because nothing has disproved it. And the building was not deteriorating. It was not becoming more dangerous over time. It was not rusting or rotting or weakening. It had always been exactly this dangerous, every single day, from the day it was built. It was a loaded weapon sitting on a shelf, in a room full of children, with no one watching. It was just waiting for the one day when normal stopped. By March of 1908, 325 children attended Lakeview Elementary. They knew one way in and one way out. They had walked that route every day of their school lives. In roughly 60 minutes, 172 of them would be dead. But that morning, as they walked to school in the cold March air, as their breath trailed behind them like small ghosts, as they hung their coats and took their seats and waited for the day to begin, the building looked exactly the way it always had. Safe. March 4th, 1908 was a Wednesday. The kind of unremarkable midweek morning that disappears from memory as soon as it passes, indistinguishable from the Wednesday before, identical to the Wednesday ahead, unless something happens to seal it there permanently, unless something burns it into the calendar forever. The weather was cold, overcast, late winter in the Great Lakes region, not bitterly cold, not the kind of cold that keeps you home, but raw, a damp cold that settles into wool coats and numbs fingers. The kind of day where the warmth of the school building felt like relief the moment you stepped through the door. Children walked to school in groups as they always did. Some came from a few blocks away, some from farther. Brothers and sisters walked together, a 6-year-old holding the hand of a 10-year-old. Neighbors' children joined them along the way. They carried their books. Some carried their lunches. Some had their scarves pulled up over their chins. They moved through the village the way children move through a village they know by heart, without urgency, without worry, with the casual certainty that the world they walked through would be the same world they walked through tomorrow. They entered through the front door, crossed the vestibule, their shoes on the wooden floor, climbed the front staircase, found their classrooms, sat down. 325 students, ages 6 to 14, some in their first year of school, still learning to sit still, some in their last, already thinking about the world beyond these walls. Their teachers greeted them. Attendance was taken, the rustle of paper and the scrape of chairs. Lessons began. In the basement, Fritz Herder tended the furnace, checked the pipes, made sure the building was warm. It was his daily routine. He had done it 1,000 times. The building hummed with its ordinary life. In a village of 8,000 people, 325 children is not just a number. It is nearly every family. You need to understand that. You need to feel the weight of it. 325 children in a village of 8,000 means that almost every household, almost every dinner table, almost every front porch in Collinwood had a child, or 2, or 3, inside that building on any given school day. Many families had multiple children in the school at the same time, siblings in different classrooms on different floors, a 6-year-old on the first floor just learning to read, a 10-year-old on the second floor working through arithmetic, a 13-year-old on the third floor near the end of their schooling. All in the same building, all under the same roof, all using the same staircase, all heading for the same vestibule if anything ever went wrong. When parents sent their children to school that morning, when they buttoned their coats and adjusted their hats and pushed them out the front door with a kiss or a wave or a reminder to behave, they were not worried. Why would they be? It was school. It was the building their children went to every single day. It was the most ordinary part of the most ordinary routine in their lives. Some of those parents would lose every child they had before lunchtime. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, the school day was in full motion. Children were in their classrooms. Teachers were teaching. The hallways were quiet, that particular institutional quiet between lessons. No footsteps, no voices, just the muffled sound of instruction through closed doors. In the basement near the furnace, something changed. The exact cause of the fire has never been established with absolute certainty. The most likely explanation, based on the inquest and subsequent investigation, is overheated steam pipes or furnace flues in contact with the building's wooden structural elements. Wooden joists, wooden beams, wood that had been slowly drying for 7 years inside those brick walls, seasoning in the warmth of the furnace below, becoming more porous, more absorbent, more flammable with each passing season. A small fire began, perhaps against a joist where it met a flue pipe, perhaps in a gap between the basement ceiling and the first floor, the hidden space where wood and heat had been in quiet contact for years. It was not dramatic. It did not explode. It did not roar to life. It smoldered. Then it caught. Then it grew slowly, quietly in the parts of the building that no one could see. Smoke began to rise, thin at first, curling upward through the gaps in the floor, seeping into the spaces between walls, finding its way the way smoke always does toward open air. Fritz Herder saw it first. What happens next takes no more than 20 minutes. From the first sign of smoke to the last child who could be reached, the entire catastrophe, every death, every scream, every hand that could not find a door unfolds in the span of time it takes to teach a single lesson. 20 minutes, 172 children. This is where every decision made in 1901 comes to collect its cost. Fritz Herder discovered the smoke in the basement near the furnace area. It was thin at first, a haze, barely visible, the kind of thing a man who works near a coal furnace every day might dismiss as nothing. An overheated pipe, a smoldering rag left too close to the flue, a draft pulling ash in the wrong direction. His first instinct, and it was a natural one, a human one, the instinct of a man who took pride in his work, was to deal with it himself. He was the janitor. The building was his responsibility. The furnace was his domain. He knew it the way a mechanic knows an engine, by sound, by smell, by feel. If there was a small fire near the furnace, it was his job to put it out. That's what janitors did. That's what he had always done. If he raised an alarm and it turned out to be nothing, a wisp of smoke from a clogged flue, a spark that died on its own, he would have disrupted the entire school day for nothing. He would have sent 300 children streaming out into the cold for no reason. He would have looked foolish. So he tried to fight it. He grabbed what he could. He tried to smother it. He tried to contain it. The accounts don't tell us exactly what tools he had, a bucket, perhaps, or a wet cloth or his own coat. What the accounts do tell us is that he was alone in that basement and the fire was growing and he was losing. This decision, and it was a decision, even if it lasted only seconds, even if it was made on instinct rather than calculation, would be examined relentlessly in the weeks that followed. At the coroner's inquest, in the newspapers, in the whispered conversations of a grieving village that needed someone, anyone, to blame. Was Herder negligent? Was he a coward? Was he culpable? The answer is simpler and more terrible than any of those. Fritz Herder was a man without training, without a protocol, without anyone having ever told him in any official capacity at any point in his employment what to do if fire appeared in the basement of a school filled with 300 children. No one had ever sat him down and said, "If you see smoke, forget the fire. Sound the alarm. Get the children out. Nothing else matters." No one told him that because no one had imagined the scenario. No one had planned for it. No one had written a procedure. He had no script for this moment. So he did what seemed reasonable. He tried to handle it. The fire was not interested in what seemed reasonable. It grew. The exact number of minutes Fritz Herder spent fighting the fire alone is not known with precision. Estimates from the inquest and from survivor accounts range from 2 to 5 minutes. Somewhere in that window, somewhere between the moment he first saw smoke and the moment the alarm finally reached the classrooms above, the fire crossed a threshold. It went from something a man with a bucket might contain to something that no man with a bucket could stop. 2 to 5 minutes. It may not sound like much. In the ordinary course of a day, 2 minutes is nothing. The time it takes to tie a shoe, to pour a cup of coffee, to walk from one end of a hallway to the other. But in a building with 300 children, a single staircase, inward opening doors, and no fire drill protocol, every minute is a different universe of possibility. 2 minutes earlier, and the hallway would have been clearer of smoke. The first floor corridor, the one the children had to walk through to reach the front staircase, would have been breathable, visible, navigable. The children would have been calmer. The evacuation would have had a slightly wider window of order before panic set in. The vestibule might have processed enough children before the crush built up. 5 minutes earlier, and every child in the building could likely have walked out the front door without incident. An orderly, unhurried evacuation. Classes filing down the staircase one at a time. The vestibule handling the flow the way it was designed to handle it. A few children at a time, doors swinging freely, the outside air welcoming them out. We will never know exactly how many minutes were lost. We will never know which side of that 2 to 5 window herder fell on. We know only that the minutes were lost, and that they could not be given back. At approximately 9:35, 5 minutes after herder first saw smoke, give or take a margin that history cannot close, the alarm reached the classrooms. The accounts differ on the exact sequence. Some say herder ran up the basement stairs and shouted into the first-floor hallway. Some say a teacher smelled the smoke first, caught the scent of something burning, something wrong, something that didn't belong in a school at 9:30 in the morning, and stepped into the corridor to investigate. Some say the alert came all at once, a single cry rippling through the building like a wave. Others say it spread unevenly. One classroom learning of the fire seconds before the next, a staggered awakening that meant some children were already in the stairwell before others had left their seats. What is clear, what every account agrees on, is that by the time the teachers knew there was a fire, smoke was already entering the first-floor hallway. It was coming up through the basement stairwell. The same open, unenclosed stairwell that connected the basement directly to the main first-floor corridor. There was no fire door between them, no barrier of any kind. The stairwell was an open channel, a chimney, effectively connecting the fire below to the air above, drawing smoke upward and feeding it into the hallway where the children needed to walk. There was no fire alarm system in the building. No bell wired to a pull station, no connection to the fire department, no sprinkler heads on the ceilings, no smoke detectors, those didn't exist yet, not in any practical form. The building had no mechanical way of knowing it was on fire and no mechanical way of telling anyone. The alarm was a human voice, a shout, a teacher's cry, a man running up the stairs with fear on his face. And then movement. The teachers reacted immediately. This must be said clearly because it matters. The teachers were not negligent. They were not paralyzed. They were not slow or confused or indifferent. They heard the alarm and they moved. They did exactly what anyone would do, what you would do, what I would do in the same situation with the same information and the same training. They told the children to leave the building. But there was no protocol, no rehearsed sequence, no assigned routes. No teacher had ever been given a map with arrows pointing to alternate exits. No teacher had ever stood in the hallway with a stopwatch and timed the flow. No teacher had ever walked her class down the rear staircase and said, "This is the way we go if we can't go the other way." None of that existed. None of it had ever been created, because no one had imagined they would need it. So the teachers did the only thing available to them, the only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt right, the only thing that the building itself suggested by its design. They directed their students to the front staircase, the staircase they always used, the staircase every child in the building had walked down every day of their school lives, the only staircase most of the children even knew existed. On the third floor, teachers opened their classroom doors. Children filed out. They entered the hallway. They started down. On the second floor, the same thing. Doors opened. Children moved into the hallway. They joined the stream heading for the stairs. Some were orderly. Some were hurried. Some were beginning to smell the smoke. On the first floor, Children were already moving toward the front entrance. Some could smell smoke now, not the distant hint of something burning, but the real thing, acrid and chemical, the smell of wood and varnish being consumed. Some could see it, gray wisps curling along the ceiling of the hallway, moving slowly like something alive, creeping forward ahead of the fire that produced it. Within seconds, the main staircase was filled with children from all 3 floors. Not in a panic, not yet. Not screaming, not pushing, not trampling. Moving quickly, yes. Moving with urgency, but in something close to order. Something close to what an evacuation should look like if you were watching from the outside, if you didn't know what was waiting at the bottom. 300 children, 1 staircase, moving downward. Toward the vestibule. The first children reached the vestibule and the inner doors. For a few seconds, perhaps 30, perhaps 60, the system worked. Hands on handles, doors pulled open. Children stepping through, crossing the vestibule, pushing through the outer doors, stumbling out into the cold March air. Alive. Free. It was working. And then it stopped. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about crowds. Not crowds of adults, crowds of children. Small bodies, lighter frames, less strength. Less ability to brace, to push back, to resist the pressure of the mass behind them. When a crowd moves through a narrow passage, flow is determined entirely by the narrowest point, not the widest part, not the average width, the narrowest point, the bottleneck. Everything upstream of that bottleneck will fill to capacity, and everything downstream will starve. The staircase could hold perhaps 6 children abreast. The hallway at the base of the stairs was slightly narrower. The vestibule was 8 feet wide, but the inner doors, when fully open, provided an effective opening of perhaps 4 to 5 feet. That was the bottleneck. That was the point that governed everything. Under calm conditions, under the conditions the building was designed for, children can file through an opening like that at a rate of maybe 2 or 3 per second. At that rate, 300 children could theoretically exit in 2 to 3 minutes, maybe 4. It would be tight, but it would work. But that rate depends on one critical thing. The people at the front must be able to move forward freely. They must be able to step through the doorway, clear the threshold, and make room for the person behind them. The moment the front slows, the moment someone stumbles, the moment the doors don't cycle fast enough, the moment the space beyond the doors fills up, the entire system fails. Because the rear doesn't know the front has stopped. Human beings in a crowd cannot stop themselves when pressure builds from behind. This is not a choice. It is not a failure of discipline or character. It is physics. When dozens of bodies press forward, the force is transmitted through the crowd like a wave. The people at the back push the people in the middle, who push the people at the front. No individual in that chain can resist the aggregate force. You are moved by the crowd whether you want to move or not. And on the staircase above, the smoke was thickening. The children higher up, the 3rd floor students, the 2nd floor students still descending, could not see what was happening below. They couldn't see the vestibule. They couldn't see the doors. They couldn't see the pile that was beginning to form. They could only see the staircase ahead of them and the smoke behind them and the backs of the children in front of them. They knew only one thing: the exit was below and the fire was above. They pushed harder. It happened in seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The flow of children through the vestibule doors slowed. Perhaps a child stumbled on the threshold, a small foot catching the edge of the doorframe. Perhaps too many children arrived at the inner doors at the same instant, creating a momentary jam. Perhaps the doors didn't swing back fast enough after the last group pushed through, the hinges resisting, the wood catching, the fraction of a second that the doors needed to reset becoming a fraction of a second the system no longer had. The children immediately behind pressed forward. Forward was the only direction that existed. Forward was where the exit was. Forward was where the air was. Forward was survival. The children at the doors could no longer step back to pull them open. The inward opening doors required a simple thing: space. Space for the door to swing toward you. Space for you to step aside and let it pass. A foot of clearance. Maybe two. That space no longer existed. It was filled with children. The children behind had closed the gap. There were bodies where the door needed to swing. Hands pinned against the door's surface. Faces pressed against the wood. And the door could not move because the physics would not allow it. You cannot pull a door open when the force of 100 bodies is pressing you against it. Someone fell. Once a child fell in the vestibule. The mathematics of the disaster became irreversible. The children behind stepped on them, stepped on a classmate, a friend, a sibling, not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but because they had no choice. The pressure from the staircase was irresistible. You could not stop. You could not turn around. You could not step sideways. The walls were there. The doors were there. The bodies were there. You moved in the direction the mass moved, or you went down. And if you went down, you did not get up. More children fell on top of the first. The pile grew, layer upon layer. In seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, an interval so small it cannot be meaningfully measured against the scale of what it produced. The vestibule floor was covered with bodies. Children lying on top of children, pressed against the doors that would not open, pressed against the walls that would not give, pressed against each other with a force that no child's body was built to withstand. The flow stopped completely. The vestibule was blocked, not partially, completely, from floor to ceiling. A solid mass of intertwined children filling the space like concrete poured into a mold. And the staircase behind it was still full of children. Hundreds of children, still pressing down, still pressing forward, pushing into a space that had ceased to be a passageway and had become a wall made of their classmates. The children at the bottom of that pile were suffocated first, crushed by the weight of the children above them. Their ribcage compressed until their lungs could not expand, their diaphragms pinned, their mouths open trying to draw air that would not come because there was no room in their chests for it to go. They did not scream for long. Screaming requires breath. Breath requires expansion. Expansion requires space. There was no space. They were not burning. The fire had not reached them yet. The fire was still below, still working its way through the basement, still climbing the wooden joists, still reaching for the staircase. They were being killed by the weight of other children. Children who were trying to do the same thing they were trying to do. Children who wanted the same thing they wanted. To get out. And above them the smoke was rising, filling the stairwell from the bottom up, filling the hallways, darkening the air, and still more children were coming, still descending, still following the only route they knew, because no one not once in 7 years had shown them any other way. If you've made it this far, you understand something that most accounts of this disaster miss. The fire didn't kill these children. The building killed them, one architectural decision at a time. The wood, the staircase, the doors, the absent fire escapes, the fire drills that never happened. Each decision stacked on the last, forming a chain that pulled tight the moment the first wisp of smoke rose from the basement. What happens next, the vestibule, the rescue attempts, the parents who arrived too late, is the part of this story that stays with you. Stay with me. There is no gentle way to describe what happened inside that vestibule. I've tried to find one. There isn't one. The space was approximately 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Close your eyes and picture the smallest room in your home, a coat closet, a pantry, a bathroom. That's the size. That's the space we're talking about. A space you would walk through in 2 steps on any normal day without noticing it existed. A space so small it doesn't even register as a room. It's a transition, a threshold, a place between places. By approximately 9:40 in the morning, no more than 5 minutes after the evacuation began, that space contained dozens of children. Not standing, not crowded, layered, compressed, stacked from the floor to within inches of the ceiling. Living children on top of dying children on top of dead children. The ones at the bottom died first. Suffocation, compression, their small chests unable to expand against the weight pressing down on them. Not just the weight of one child, but the aggregate weight of a column of bodies, transmitted downward by gravity and by the continued pressure from the staircase behind. They did not scream for long because they could not draw breath to scream. The silence started at the bottom and moved upward. The ones in the middle were trapped, unable to move in any direction, arms pinned against their bodies or against the body of the child next to them, legs bent at angles that the human skeleton is not meant to hold, faces pressed against the back of another child's head or against the wall or against the door that still would not open. Some were conscious. Some had lost consciousness from the pressure on their chests. Some called out small voices, muffled by the bodies around them, calling for their mothers, calling for their teachers, calling for anyone. Some went silent before the fire ever reached them. The ones at the top, the last to arrive in the pile, could still breathe for now, but they could not move. They were held in place by the mass below them and the unrelenting pressure from behind, and they could see the vestibule doors, right there, still closed, still immovable. And some of them, the ones closest to the outer wall, could see daylight through the cracks in the doorframe, could feel the draft of outside air, cold March air, alive and moving, seeping through the gaps. They could feel freedom on their skin. They could not reach it. The survivors' children who were pulled from the edges of the crush, children who had been near the walls and not at the center, children who had been pulled back at the last second by a teacher who grabbed a coat collar or an arm, described the sound afterward. They described it for years. They described it until they died. Some of them never stopped describing it. Hundreds of children screaming at once. A sound so dense, so saturated, so complete that it ceased to be individual voices and became something else entirely. A single sustained wall of sound, high-pitched, desperate, animal, filling the stairwell and the vestibule and pouring out through the cracks in the walls. And then, gradually, fewer voices, the screaming thinning, individual cries becoming distinguishable again, not because the survivors could hear better, but because there were fewer children still capable of making sound. And then fewer still. Not every child went to the front staircase. And this is one of the most painful ironies of the Collinwood disaster, an irony so cruel that it feels like it was designed by someone with a talent for suffering. The children who survived were, overwhelmingly, the ones who did not do what they were supposed to do. Think about that, sit with it for a moment. The children who followed the routine, who did what they had always been told, who went where they had always gone, who trusted the adults and trusted the building, and trusted the path that had always led them safely outside. Those were the children who died. The ones who survived were the rule breakers, the disobedient ones, the frightened ones who ran the wrong way, the ones whose panic, the very thing adults always tell children to suppress, drove them away from the crowd and toward salvation. Some teachers, and these teachers deserve to be remembered with the deepest respect history can offer, recognized what was happening before it was too late. They heard the screams from below. They saw the smoke filling the stairwell. They understood with the clarity that only terror produces that the front staircase was no longer an exit. It was a grave. And so they redirected their students. They told them to go to the rear of the building, to use the back staircase, the narrow one, the unfamiliar one, the one most of them had never walked down, to go to the windows, to do the thing that every instinct and every lesson had told them not to do, go a different way. Some children went on their own, without direction, without permission. Younger children, sometimes 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, who were so frightened by the smoke and the screaming that they ran in the opposite direction from the crowd. Children who instinctively avoided the mass of bodies rather than joining it. Children whose fear saved them, because their fear told them the truth that the building's design had hidden. Some children jumped from windows. First-floor windows, a short drop 4 or 5 feet, a tumble onto frozen ground. Bruises but survival. Second-floor windows, higher, more dangerous but survivable, especially for the older children, the 13 and 14-year-olds who could hang from the sill and shorten the fall. Some were caught by adults who had gathered outside, men who held out their arms and shouted for the children to jump, who caught them like sacks of flour and set them on their feet and turned back for the next one. Some landed on the frozen ground and broke bones, wrists, ankles, collarbones, but lived. Some children were pulled through windows by neighbors and parents who arrived early enough to reach the building, while children were still alive inside. Hands reaching through broken glass, arms bleeding from the shards, lifting small bodies over the sill and passing them backward, hand to hand, away from the building. Approximately 150 children survived that morning. Most of them, the vast majority, because they found, or were shown, or stumbled upon an alternative to the front staircase. The children who followed the rules, who went where they always went, who did what they were always told to do, who trusted the building and the routine and the adults who had built both, those were the ones who died. Their obedience killed them. And that is a sentence no one should ever have to write about 6-year-olds. The rear staircase and exit did exist. It was there. It had always been there, narrower than the front, less prominent, tucked away at the back of the building like an afterthought, which is what it was. Some children who reached it survived, but the rear exit was not a clean escape. It experienced its own crowding, not the catastrophic, fatal crush of the front vestibule, not the floor-to-ceiling wall of bodies, but enough to slow the evacuation, enough to create confusion and fear, enough to trap some children in the rear stairwell as smoke descended from above and heat rose from below. The rear exit saved lives, but it saved fewer than it could have, fewer than it should have, because most children didn't know to use it. They had never been directed to it. They had never walked that route. In a moment of terror and smoke, when the air was going dark and the screaming was everywhere and every second felt like the last second you would ever have, children went where their feet knew to go. A single fire drill, one afternoon of practice, one walkthrough of an alternate route, one teacher standing at the back staircase saying, "This way, children. This is how we go if we can't go the other way," could have redirected dozens of children away from the front vestibule, perhaps hundreds. That drill never happened. Not once in 7 years. By approximately 9:45, perhaps 10 minutes after the crush began, perhaps 15 minutes after the fire first appeared in the basement, the fire itself reached the stairwell and the vestibule. The wooden staircase burned. The dry, seasoned wood, 7 years of slow drying in the warmth of the furnace below, caught and consumed itself with a speed that witnesses later described as shocking. The banisters burned. The wooden floor joists above the basement burned. The fire climbed the building the way it had always been going to climb it, through the wood, along the wood, inside the wood, following the path that the building's own construction had laid out for it. And then the fire reached the mass of children in the vestibule. Many of them, most of them, were already dead, suffocated, crushed, their bodies compressed into a single mass so tightly intertwined, so thoroughly fused by pressure and position, that they would later prove nearly impossible to separate. Recovery workers in the days that followed would describe the vestibule as containing not individual bodies but a single object, a solid mass of human remains, melded together by force and by fire. The fire consumed them. Not because it killed them, most were already beyond saving, already beyond pain, already beyond anything the fire could add to what the building had already done. But it destroyed the evidence of how they died. It burned away faces. It burned away hair. It burned away clothing, the coats they had hung on hooks that morning, the dresses their mothers had sewn, the shoes their fathers had bought. It burned away everything that would have allowed a parent to look at their child and know them. The building that trapped them alive now made them unrecognizable in death. It took even that. As smoke poured from the school, black smoke, thick and heavy, visible from blocks away, rising above the rooftops of Collinwood like a signal, the village responded. Neighbors saw it first. The people who lived closest to the school, whose front porches faced the building, whose kitchen windows looked out onto the schoolyard. They saw the smoke and they knew. They didn't wait to be told. They didn't wait for an alarm or a siren or an official announcement. They ran. Men came running from nearby houses, from shops along the main street, from the rail yards where they worked. They dropped what they were holding. They left doors open behind them. They ran toward the building because the building held their children, or their neighbors' children, or the children of people they passed on the street every day. Some went to the windows on the first floor, the windows on the second floor. They broke the glass with their fists, with bricks, with whatever they could find. They reached inside and grabbed arms, clothing, hair, anything, and pulled. Small bodies lifted through broken window frames, handed backward to others who carried them away from the building. Some of these men were burned, their hands, their forearms, their faces, as heat pushed out through the openings they had created. Some were cut by glass, deep cuts, cuts that bled freely, cuts they didn't notice until hours later. They kept reaching. They reached until there was no one left to reach. Some went to the front entrance, and there they found the vestibule. A man named Wallace Upson, some accounts spell the name differently, some give a different first name entirely, but the act itself is documented across multiple sources, and the act is what matters, entered the front of the building as smoke billowed from the doorway. He could see the mass. He could see the children, not individual children, a mass. A wall of small bodies wedged into the vestibule space, packed against the doors, layered on top of each other. Some were still moving, some were not. He began pulling at them, trying to free them from the outside, trying to get a grip on an arm, a leg, a coat, anything that would allow him to extract a child from the mass and drag them to safety. He could not. The pressure from inside was too great. The bodies were too tightly packed. The children were pressed together with a force that exceeded what any single man could overcome. He pulled at arms and they did not come free. He pulled at clothing and it tore away in his hands. He gripped and he strained and he shouted, and the mass did not yield. The accounts say that some children came free, fragments, partial rescues, children pulled from the edges of the pile where the compression was less total. But the core of the mass was immovable. It was a solid object. It weighed as much as a car. It was held in place by the geometry of the vestibule and by the continued pressure from the staircase behind it, where more children who were already dead, children held upright only by the bodies around them, continued to press forward with the weight of gravity and the weight of the children above them. Wallace Upson did not come out. He entered the building knowing what was inside it. He stayed because he could not stop himself from trying. And the fire caught him the way it caught everything else inside those brick walls, without discrimination, without mercy, without caring whether the body it consumed belonged to a child or to the man who had come to save them. His body was found among theirs, one adult surrounded by children, a rescuer who became a casualty, a man who gave his life for children he could not free. 2 teachers died that morning. Their names appear inconsistently across the sources: the chaos of the aftermath, the destruction of records by fire, the grief of a small community so overwhelmed by the scale of its loss that the details blurred and shifted in the retelling. Historians have worked to reconstruct the precise identities, but the records of a village in shock are not the records of a calm and orderly institution. Names were misspelled. Roles were confused. What was remembered was not always what was written down. But what is consistent, what every source agrees on, is what they did. They stayed with their students. At least one teacher on an upper floor was seen by survivors directing children toward the rear windows even as smoke filled the hallway around her. She could be heard through the haze, a voice, firm and steady, cutting through the screaming, telling children which way to go, pushing them toward the windows, physically turning children around who were trying to join the crowd heading for the front staircase. She could have gone first. She could have climbed out a window. She could have saved herself. She was an adult. She was strong enough. She could have made it. She stayed in the corridor. She stayed because there were still children in the hallway. She stayed because that's who she was. She pushed children toward an exit that she herself would never reach. Another teacher was found in the stairwell. She had been descending with her class, walking behind them the way teachers do at the rear of the line, watching for stragglers, making sure no one was left behind. She did not abandon them when the stairway became impassable. She did not push past them. She did not climb over them. She died where they died, in the stairwell among her students. They were not trained for this. They had no protocol. They had no fire-resistant clothing, no breathing apparatus, no radio to call for help. They had nothing except the instinct that had brought them into teaching in the first place, the instinct to stay with the children they were responsible for. They did not survive that instinct, but some of their students did. Some of those students lived because a teacher turned them around and pointed them toward a window. Some of those students grew up and had children of their own and grew old, because on a Wednesday morning in March, a woman whose name the records cannot fully agree on chose not to save herself. The Collinwood Fire Department arrived at approximately 9:50 in the morning, 20 minutes after the fire began, perhaps 15 minutes after the alarm reached the classrooms. They were not late, not by the standards of 1908, not for a volunteer department in a small village. They responded as quickly as they could to an alarm that reached them the only way it could, by a man running to the station on foot, because the school had no alarm box, no telephone connection, no way to summon help other than a human being covering the distance between the school and the firehouse at a full sprint. They arrived to a building that was already beyond saving. The front vestibule was blocked, not by rubble, not by collapsed walls, not by fallen timber, by the bodies of children, floor to ceiling. A solid mass filling the vestibule like mortar fills a joint completely, densely, without gaps. The firefighters who looked through the outer doorway and saw what was inside did not find words for it at first. The words came later, at the inquest, in the newspapers, in the quiet conversations they had with their families in the years that followed. One firefighter, quoted in the Cleveland Press, described it plainly. They were piled up like cordwood from the floor to the ceiling. You couldn't tell where one child ended and another began. The firefighters attempted to enter through the rear and through windows. They raised ladders. They broke glass. They reached inside and found, in some rooms, children still alive, huddled near windows, gasping for air, waiting for someone to come. The last survivors, the final rescues. Children extracted from upper-floor windows in the closing minutes before the interior of the building became entirely unsurvivable. Before the heat and the smoke and the collapsing structure made it impossible for any living person to remain inside. But for most, it was too late. The fire had been burning for 20 minutes or more. The wooden interior was fully engaged, every floor, every wall, every beam feeding the inferno. The staircase was gone, consumed. The hallways were gone. The classrooms were chambers of fire. By 10:15, the interior of Lakeview Elementary collapsed. The floors gave way, the second floor falling into the first, the third floor following, all of it cascading downward into the basement in a roar of splintering wood and breaking brick. The exterior walls remained standing. The shell held, but everything inside was consumed. 3 stories of wooden floors, wooden walls, wooden stairs, and 172 children fell into the burning basement. The firefighters turned their hoses on the ruins. There was nothing else to do. The parents arrived in waves. The first wave was the closest, the mothers and fathers who lived within sight of the school, who saw the smoke from their windows, who felt the wrongness in their stomachs before they understood it in their minds. They came running, some still wearing aprons, some in work boots covered in the grime of the rail yard or the factory. They did not walk, they ran, and they screamed. They screamed their children's names at the building, at the smoke, at the brick walls, at the windows, as if sound could reach where hands could not. Some arrived while rescuers were still pulling children from windows. They saw small bodies being lifted out and passed hand over hand and set on the frozen ground, and they searched every face, every coat, every pair of shoes looking for theirs. Some found them, alive, burned sometimes, bleeding sometimes, coughing, choking, shaking with a terror that would never fully leave them, but breathing, alive. The relief of those parents, the parents who found their children alive, existed in the same space, at the same moment, as the agony of the parents who did not. The second wave arrived later, called from work, called from home by a neighbor who pounded on the door, called by a stranger who stopped them on the street. Something has happened at the school. The words arrived without context, without detail, without mercy, just the fact. Something has happened. Go. They arrived to find the building gutted, brick walls standing, a hollow shell, smoke still rising from the ruins inside, firefighters standing in puddles of black water, and crowds of parents, of neighbors, of strangers, of people who had come from Cleveland to help or to stare, gathered outside, staring at the remains of the building where they had sent their children that morning. And then the recovery began. The recovery of remains started that afternoon and continued for days. The work was slow and terrible and necessary. The ruins were still hot. The debris was tangled with wire and pipe and the collapsed remnants of 3 floors. And within the debris, especially within the vestibule, especially at the base of the stairwell, were the children. Temporary morgues were established. Some accounts placed them in nearby buildings, churches, community halls, any space large enough to hold what needed to be held. Others described tents erected outside the ruins. Families were asked to come and identify their children. What they were asked to identify bore little resemblance to their children. The fire had been so thorough, the compression in the vestibule so complete, that many of the bodies were burned beyond recognition. Beyond the point where a face could be distinguished, beyond the point where size or build could narrow the identification, beyond the point where anything remained that looked human, let alone like a specific human, let alone like a specific child that a mother had bathed and dressed and kissed that morning. Parents identified their sons and daughters by objects, by possessions, by the small, mundane, heartbreaking things that survived when the children who wore them did not. A shoe, a particular shoe with a particular buckle that a mother recognized because she had fastened it that morning. A hair ribbon, a specific color, a specific pattern tied into hair that no longer existed. A belt buckle, a fragment of fabric, the remnant of a dress that a mother had sewn herself, sitting at a table in a kitchen that would never again hear that child's voice. One parent, quoted in the Cleveland Press in the days following the disaster, spoke 5 words that carry more weight than any coroner's report, any legislative record, any official finding. I identified my daughter by her shoes. That was all that was left that I could recognize. Some children were never identified at all. The fire took even that. The last mercy, the ability to bury your child, to mark a grave, to know with certainty that the small body in the coffin was the one you had carried and rocked and loved, was denied to some families entirely. Their children simply disappeared, into the fire, into the vestibule, into the mass of unidentifiable remains that the village would bury together because there was no other way. 172 children, 2 teachers, 1 rescuer, 175 people dead. In a village of 8,000. The fire was out, the building was a ruin, the dead were being counted. What comes next is what Collinwood did with its grief, and what America did with its guilt. The funerals began within days. They did not end for weeks. You have to understand what 172 dead children means to a village of 8,000 people. It doesn't mean 172 separate tragedies, each contained within its own household, each grieved behind its own front door. It means the destruction of a community, the erasure of an entire generation from a single place. It means entire streets where no children play, houses where the bedrooms upstairs are empty and will remain empty, dinner tables with chairs that no one sits in, coat hooks in hallways where small jackets still hang because no one can bring themselves to take them down. Families who lost 1 child, families who lost 2, families who lost 3. Families, and the records confirm this in the blunt accounting of names and addresses, who lost every child they had, every son, every daughter. The family line ending not in old age, not in illness, not in war, but on a Wednesday morning in March, in a school they had built with their tax dollars and trusted with the only things that mattered to them. Some families held individual funerals when identification was possible. Small caskets, so small that the men who carried them remarked on how light they were. Packed churches, Slovenian Catholic, Italian Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist, each one filled beyond capacity because in a village this size, every death was everyone's death. The same priest delivering the same words over a different child. The same minister opening the same Bible to the same passage. Day after day after day. A different family at the front of the church each morning, a different name on the casket, but the same grief, the same impossible, unanswerable question hanging in the air like the incense. Why? For those children who could not be identified, and there were many, more than the village wanted to admit, more than the records can precisely count. Mass burials were held at Lakeview Cemetery in Collinwood. The unidentified remains were interred together in a common grave, not because the community did not care, not because individual burial was too expensive, not because the families didn't want to bury their own children in their own plots with their own headstones, because the fire had made individual burial impossible. The building had taken even that. The last act a parent can perform for a child, the act of laying them to rest, of knowing where they are, of placing flowers on a specific grave and speaking to a specific name, was denied because the fire consumed the evidence of identity itself. Because a child who could not be identified could not be claimed, and a child who could not be claimed could only be buried with the others together in the shared earth. A memorial was erected over the common grave, carved stone, tall enough to see from the cemetery road. The names of the victims were inscribed, all 172 of them, identified and unidentified alike. The identified received their names. The unidentified received their place among the names. A monument standing over the ground where Collinwood put its children and tried, with stone, with letters, with the only permanence it could offer to understand why. The monument does not explain what happened. It does not describe the vestibule. It does not mention the doors. It does not assign blame or offer analysis or make an argument. It lists names and a date. That is all. It is enough. Collinwood did not recover, not in the way that word is usually meant, not in the way we use it when we say a community came back, rebuilt, found its footing again. Something came back, but it was not the same thing. The village continued to exist. People went to work in the morning and came home at night. The railroad still ran. The shops still opened. The streets still had names and the houses still had addresses and the mail was still delivered. Remaining children eventually went to school, in other buildings in neighboring towns, never again in a building that looked anything like Lakeview Elementary. Parents who still had children held them closer, walked them to school, stood at the schoolhouse door and watched until they were inside and the door closed behind them. Some parents could not let go of their children's hands at the threshold. Some parents could never again hear a school bell ring without feeling their stomachs tighten and their breath go shallow. But the fabric of the community, the invisible web of shared life that makes a village more than a collection of houses, was torn in a way that could not be mended. The thing that connected these people was their children, and their children were gone. Families left. Quietly, one at a time, over months and years. Some moved to Cleveland. Some moved farther. Some could not bear to remain in a village where every street corner and every neighbor's face was a reminder. Where the empty lot where the school had stood was visible from their front porch. Where the silence of a street without children was louder than any sound. In 1910, just 2 years after the fire, Collinwood was annexed into the city of Cleveland. The village ceased to exist as an independent entity. It was absorbed into the larger city, its boundaries dissolved, its government merged, its identity subsumed. Some historians record this as an unremarkable municipal consolidation, one of many small villages swallowed by Cleveland's expansion during this period. A footnote, a line in an administrative record. Others see it differently. Others see the annexation as the final act of a community that could no longer sustain itself. A village that had lost too many of its children to remain whole. A place that voted to stop being a place, not because it was forced to, but because the thing that had made it a place was gone. The neighborhood is still there today. It is called North Collinwood. It is part of Cleveland's east side near the lake. There are houses and streets and shops. People live there. Children live there. The school site is a memorial park, a small, quiet piece of ground. There is no school on it. There will never be a school on it again. Most people who walk past it do not know what happened there. There is no ruin to see. There is no scar on the earth, just grass and a marker and the weight of a date. The monument at Lakeview Cemetery still stands. The names are still legible. 172 names. Some of them the same last name, listed one after another, siblings, buried together in the same earth, having died together in the same vestibule, on the same morning, in the same building their parents had trusted. But the village that built Lakeview Elementary, the village of 8,000 people who had come from across oceans to build something for their children, is gone. It died the same morning its children did. It just took 2 more years to lie down. A coroner's inquest was convened in March of 1908 and continued into April. It was thorough. It was methodical. It was conducted by men who understood that the record they were creating would be read not just by Collinwood, but by the entire country, and that the questions they asked and the answers they documented would determine whether 172 children had died for nothing or whether their deaths would produce something that outlived them. The inquest examined every aspect of the disaster: the origin of the fire, the design of the building, the materials used in its construction, the number and location of exits, the width of the staircase, the dimensions of the vestibule, the direction the doors swung, the actions of the school staff, the actions of the janitor, the response time of the fire department, the condition of the furnace, the maintenance records. Fritz Herder was questioned extensively, brought before the panel, questioned again. Had he delayed the alarm? Could he have acted faster? Was the furnace properly maintained? Had he been negligent? The questioning was intense. It was also, in some sense, beside the point, because what the inquest was really asking, what it had to ask, whether it wanted to or not, was not whether Fritz Herder had made a mistake. It was whether the entire system that put Fritz Herder in that basement, alone, with no training, no protocol, and no alarm to pull, had made a mistake. Herder was not charged. No one was charged. Not because the inquest found no fault. It found fault everywhere, fault so abundant that it saturated every corner of the story. But because the fault was so distributed, so systemic, so deeply embedded in the way the building was designed and the way the system operated, that no single person could be held responsible for it. You cannot indict a door for opening the wrong way. You cannot charge an architect who followed the standard blueprint. You cannot prosecute a school board that did what every school board in the state was doing. You cannot imprison a legislature for failing to write a law that no one had demanded. The inquest's findings were devastating, not for any individual, but for the assumptions that had governed school construction for decades. The findings read like an autopsy of negligence itself. The doors opened the wrong way. That is what killed them. The inner vestibule doors opened inward, against the flow of evacuation, making them mechanically inoperable under crowd pressure. The building had no fire escapes. No external means of egress from the upper floors existed. No fire drills had ever been conducted, not one in 7 years of operation. No teacher had an evacuation plan. No child had been shown an alternate route. The interior was entirely wooden within a brick shell. The building burned from the inside while its exterior walls contained the heat. A single staircase served the entire building. 300 children funneled to one exit. The basement stairwell was open and unenclosed. Smoke traveled freely from the fire's origin point to the main corridor. There was no fire alarm system, no connection to the fire department, no mechanical means of alerting anyone. The inquest documented all of this with the precision of people who understood what they were writing. They were writing a record, not just for Collinwood, not just for Ohio, for every school in America, for every child who walked into a school building and assumed, because every child assumes, because every child must assume, that the adults who built it had thought about the worst day. They hadn't. The Collinwood fire was front-page news across the United States and internationally. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Cleveland Press, the New York Times, papers in Chicago, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in London, Wire services carried the story across the country within hours. By the evening of March 4th, the nation knew. By the morning of March 5th, it was the only story. The headlines varied in language, but not in impact. 172 children perish in school fire. Children crushed to death in panic. Collinwood School Holocaust. The word Holocaust, used in its original meaning, total destruction by fire, appeared in headline after headline. It was the only word that seemed large enough. The nation reacted with horror. And for some, for the fire safety advocates who had been arguing for years, for the engineers who had been designing outward opening doors, for the officials who had pushed for fire drills after the Iroquois Theater and been told the measures were unnecessary for schools. The reaction was not just horror. It was recognition. Because the details of the Collinwood disaster were not unfamiliar, they had seen this before: inward opening doors, blocked exits, no emergency planning, a building that worked perfectly on every day except the one that mattered, the Iroquois Theater, 5 years earlier, 602 dead. The same lesson, the same physics, the same architecture of death, different building, different city, different victims. The only difference was that this time the victims were children, not theater goers, not factory workers, not tenement dwellers. Children, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. Children whose parents had sent them to school that morning believing, because everyone believed, because the entire culture believed, because there was no reason not to believe, that a school was the safest place a child could be. And this time the nation could not look away. This time, the excuse that had been used after the Iroquois Theater, that safety reforms applied to theaters, not to schools. Because schools were different, schools were safe. Schools didn't need fire escapes. That excuse was lying in a mass grave in Collinwood, 172 names deep. In the months and years following the Collinwood fire, Ohio passed sweeping fire safety legislation for school buildings. Not gradually, not after years of debate, not through the slow, grinding process by which most laws are made, quickly, with the grief still raw, with the names still in the newspapers, with the grave still fresh in the ground. Outward opening doors, mandatory on all school exits. Every exit door in every school in the state of Ohio would open outward, in the direction of evacuation, in the direction of escape, in the direction that a crowd pressing against it would naturally push it. Never again inward. Never again against the people trying to get through. Fire escapes, required on every multi-story school building. External metal staircases bolted to the outside walls, providing a way out that bypassed the interior entirely. A way out that existed independently of the staircase, independently of the vestibule, independently of every interior system that could fail. Fire-resistant stairwell enclosures. The open stairwells that had channeled smoke from the basement to the upper floors, the chimney effect that had filled Lakeview Elementary with toxic air within minutes, would be enclosed behind fire-rated doors and walls. Smoke could no longer travel freely between floors. The stairwell would be a protected passage, not a conduit for death. Mandatory fire drills, every school, every semester, no exceptions. No excuses, no arguments about disrupted instruction time. Children would practice leaving the building. They would learn alternate routes. They would walk the rear staircase. They would know in their muscles, in their feet, in the automatic memory that training creates, where to go when the front is blocked. They would not have to think. They would not have to decide. They would move because they had moved before, because someone had shown them the way. Multiple exits. No school building could be constructed with a single primary egress route. The funnel was banned. The bottleneck was outlawed. Children would have choices. Routes would be distributed. No single failure could block every path. Maximum occupancy standards. Limits on how many students could be housed in a building based on its exit capacity, not on how many desks could fit in its classrooms, but on how many bodies could pass through its doors in the minutes available during an emergency. The building would be measured not by its capacity for education, but by its capacity for escape. Other states followed, some quickly, driven by the same horror, the same recognition that their own schools looked exactly like Lakeview Elementary. Some slowly, waiting, as governments often do, for the grief to cool and the urgency to fade before acting. Some only after their own disasters forced the issue, smaller fires, near misses, incidents that produced injuries instead of mass casualties, but that carried the same warning. But the Collinwood fire became the reference point, the case study, the name that fire safety advocates and legislators and building inspectors invoked when they argued for reform and were told it was too expensive, too disruptive, too unnecessary. It's not unnecessary, Collinwood. We can't afford it, Collinwood. It could never happen here, Collinwood. Every one of these laws addressed a specific failure of the Lakeview Elementary building. Every one of them was a direct response to a specific way that children had died on March 4, 1908. The legislation was not abstract. It was not theoretical. It was a list of corrections written in blood, each clause corresponding to a particular design choice, a particular absence, a particular door that swung the wrong way. And here is the fact that makes the tragedy complete, the fact that turns grief into something harder and sharper and more difficult to bear. Not one of these reforms required technology that did not already exist. Outward opening doors existed. They had existed for decades. They were standard in some applications. They were mandated in theaters after the Iroquois fire in 1903. The hinges were the same. The frames were the same. The cost difference was negligible. The only thing that differed was the direction of the swing. Fire escapes existed. They hung on the sides of tenements and factories across every city in America. They were ugly and they were rusted, and people complained about them, but they worked, and they had been saving lives for years. Fire drills had been proposed. Advocates had argued for them. The concept was understood. The practice was simple. It required no equipment, no construction, no expenditure. It required only the decision to do it, one afternoon, one walkthrough, one teacher saying, "Follow me." The knowledge was there, the technology was there, the solutions were there. They were available, affordable, proven, and understood. None of it was applied to schools, because the assumption, the deadly, universal, unexamined assumption that had governed American thinking about schools for as long as anyone could remember, was that schools did not need it. Schools were safe. It took the deaths of 172 children to make the obvious obvious. The Collinwood fire, along with the Iroquois Theater fire before it, accelerated the development and adoption of one specific piece of technology that you have used hundreds of times in your life. You have used it today, probably. You have used it this week, certainly. You use it every time you leave a store, a theater, an office building, a hospital, a school. You use it without thinking. You use it without knowing why it exists. You use it without any awareness that you are, in that moment, pressing your hand against a piece of metal that was forged in the aftermath of mass death. The panic bar. A horizontal metal bar, sometimes called a crash bar, sometimes called an exit device, mounted across the inside face of a door. You walk toward the door. You press against the bar with your hands, with your hip, with your forearms, with the weight of your body, with the force of a crowd pressing behind you. And the door opens. Outward. in the direction you are already moving, in the direction the crowd is already pushing. It requires no pulling, no turning of a handle, no fine motor control, no presence of mind, no calm, no training, no strength. You push and the door opens. A child can do it. A crowd can do it. A panicked mass of people who cannot see and cannot think and cannot stop can do it. It is the mechanical solution to the exact problem that killed 172 children in Collinwood, Ohio. A door that cannot be blocked by the crowd trying to pass through it. A door that converts the force of panic, the same force that sealed the vestibule, the same force that pressed children against wood until they could not breathe, into the force of opening. A door that uses fear as fuel. Every commercial building you have ever entered has panic hardware on its exit doors. Every school, every theater, every movie cinema, every shopping mall, every office tower, every hospital, every church, every library. You have never thought about it. That is the point. That is the design. You are not supposed to think about it. It is supposed to work on the day you need it, the day you hope never comes, the day no one plans for, the worst day, invisibly, silently, without requiring you to understand the engineering or the history or the reason it was invented. But the history is there, written into the metal, pressed into the hinge, embedded in the spring mechanism that pushes the latch open when weight is applied. 172 children who died because a door opened the wrong way, and the engineers who, in the weeks and months and years that followed, made certain that it would never happen that way again. Every panic bar in the world is a small monument, an invisible memorial, a piece of Collinwood installed in every building you will ever enter. You just didn't know it until now. The Collinwood Fire changed the law. It changed building codes. It changed how schools were designed and constructed across the country. In the decades that followed, school fires declined dramatically, not because fires stopped starting, but because the buildings stopped trapping the children inside. The specific mechanisms that killed children at Lakeview Elementary, inward opening doors, single staircases, absent fire escapes, unenclosed stairwells, wooden interiors behind brick facades, were systematically, methodically, relentlessly eliminated from new school construction. It should have been enough. It wasn't. On December 1st, 1958, 50 years after Collinwood, half a century later, a full generation of children born and raised in a world that was supposed to have learned this lesson. A fire broke out at Our Lady of the Angels, a Catholic elementary school on the west side of Chicago. 92 children and 3 nuns died. The school had no sprinkler system. Its fire alarm was not connected to the fire department. It rang inside the building, but no signal reached the firehouse. The alarm was an internal bell, useful only if someone inside the building heard it, and by the time they heard it, they already knew. The stairwell was open and unenclosed, acting as a chimney, exactly as the stairwell at Lakeview Elementary had acted, channeling smoke and superheated air directly from the fire's origin point to the upper floors, where the children were trapped. The school met the building code that existed at the time. That sentence needs to sit with you for a moment. The school met the code. It was inspected. It was approved. It was considered by every official standard that existed to be in compliance. But the code had not been updated in decades. The requirements that had been written in the aftermath of Collinwood had been applied to new construction, but not retroactively to old buildings. Our Lady of the Angels was an old building. It had been built before the reforms. It had been grandfathered in. It was compliant with the law as written, even though the law as written was no longer sufficient to protect the children inside. 50 years, 300 miles, different city, different building, different children, different parents standing outside a different school, screaming different names at different windows. Same lesson. Same physics, same smoke in an open stairwell, same children trapped on upper floors, same desperate jumps from windows, same small caskets, same mass grief, same unanswerable question. Collinwood proved that the absence of safety regulations kills children. Our Lady of the Angels proved something even more disturbing, something harder to accept, something that challenges the comforting belief that once a lesson is learned, it stays learned. Having regulations is not enough. Regulations must be enforced. They must be updated. They must be applied universally, not just to new buildings but to old ones, not just to public schools but to private ones, not just to the buildings that are easy to fix but to the ones that are expensive and inconvenient and politically complicated. And they must be applied not just in the years immediately following a disaster, when the grief is fresh and the political will is strong and the photographs are still on the front page, but permanently, continuously, without lapse, without fatigue, without the slow, quiet erosion of urgency that happens when the last parent who lost a child grows old and dies, and no one is left who remembers what it felt like to identify a daughter by her shoes. The lesson of Collinwood was not learned once and kept forever. It had to be learned again, in a different city with different children. And the price of relearning it was 92 more lives. The school is gone. Demolished in the weeks after the fire. The brick walls that had stood through the inferno, the shell that had held while everything inside was consumed, were pulled down. Stone by stone, brick by brick, cleared away, carted off. The rubble was removed and the earth was graded and the lot was smoothed and left empty. A memorial park sits on the site today. A small, quiet piece of ground in a Cleveland neighborhood where traffic passes and people walk their dogs and children, different children, children who will never know, ride their bicycles on the sidewalk outside. Most people who pass it do not know what happened there. There is no ruin to photograph. There is no dramatic remnant. There is no scar on the earth that you can see from the street, just grass and a marker. And a silence that has a weight to it, if you know what you're listening for. At Lakeview Cemetery, the monument still stands over the common grave. The stone is weathered now. More than a century of Ohio winters and summers have softened the edges, darkened the surface, worn the letters. But the names are still legible. 172 names, carved into stone that was chosen because it endures. Some of the names are the same last name listed one after another, sequential like entries in a family Bible. Siblings, 2 children from the same family, 3 children from the same family, entire branches of family trees, lines that had crossed oceans, that had survived poverty and immigration and the grinding work of building a new life in a new country, cut off in a single morning, in a single vestibule, by a single door. The monument does not explain how they died. It does not describe the vestibule. It does not mention the doors or the staircase or the absent fire escapes. It does not analyze the chain of decisions or assign blame or draw lessons. It bears their names and the date, and it lets the stone carry what the words cannot. March 4th, 1908. That is enough. For those who know the story, the date says everything that needs to be said. It would be comforting to treat Collinwood as a story from another era, a relic of the past, a failure that belongs to a time before we knew better, before fire codes, before safety engineering, before the accumulated wisdom of a century of building design. And in its specifics it is. The specific failures of Lakeview Elementary have been solved. Schools have outward opening doors now. Fire escapes. Fire drills practiced so routinely that children groan when the alarm sounds because they've done it so many times it bores them. Sprinklers in the ceilings. Alarm systems wired to the fire department. Enclosed stairwells. Multiple exits. Panic hardware on every door. The specific mechanisms that killed 172 children in 1908 have been engineered out of existence. They have been legislated away. They have been designed against, built against, inspected against. The door that opens the wrong way has been corrected. The staircase that becomes a funnel has been multiplied. The fire escape that wasn't there has been bolted to the wall. We fixed it. But the deeper failure, the failure that made Collinwood possible in the first place, the failure that preceded every design choice and every absent fire drill and every inward opening door, that failure has not been solved. Because it is not an engineering problem, it is a human one. The deeper failure is the failure of imagination. No one in Collinwood, not a single parent, not a single teacher, not a single school board member, not a single legislator, not a single architect, ever asked the question, what happens on the worst day? What happens if there's a fire? What happens if 300 children try to leave at once? What happens if the staircase fills? What happens if the doors don't open? What happens if everything we assume about this building turns out to be wrong? Not because they were stupid, not because they didn't care, not because they were negligent in any way they could have recognized or any way we should judge them harshly for, but because the worst day was unimaginable. It had never happened before. Not here. Not in a school. Not to children. It belonged to the category of things that happened to other people in other places, in other buildings, theaters, factories, tenements, the buildings where danger lived. Not here, not in a school, not to our children. Until the morning it happened here, to these children, in this school. And that is the pattern. That is the lesson of Collinwood that transcends fire codes and door hardware and the specific mechanisms of this specific disaster. It is the lesson that cannot be learned once and kept forever, because it is not a fact to be memorized. It is a practice to be maintained, a discipline, a habit of mind. The habit of asking, what if? What if this system fails? What if this assumption is wrong? What if the thing that has never happened happens today? What have we designed for the worst day and not just for the best one? That question must be asked continuously, in every generation. For every new system, every new building, every new technology, every new institution where we place our trust and our children. We design for the normal day. We build for the expected case. We test our systems under the conditions we anticipate and declare them safe when they perform as designed. And we assume, because nothing has gone wrong yet, because the doors open every morning and close every evening and the building stands and the children come home, that nothing will. Until something does. There was no single villain in Collinwood, no arsonist who struck a match, no corrupt official who pocketed the money for fire escapes, no cost-cutting contractor who knowingly substituted inferior materials, no one who woke up on the morning of March 4th, 1908 and chose, with full knowledge of the consequences, to endanger children. There was only a chain of ordinary decisions, each one reasonable, each one standard, each one made by people who were doing their jobs, following the blueprints, meeting the codes, or operating in the absence of codes, which is not the same as violating them. Each decision identical to the decisions being made at hundreds of other schools in hundreds of other villages and towns and cities across Ohio, across the Midwest, across the entire country. The wood was standard, Everyone used wood. The staircase was standard. Every school had one central staircase. The doors were standard. Inward opening doors were how doors were hung. The absence of fire escapes was standard. Schools didn't have them. The absence of fire drills was standard. No one conducted them. Everything was standard. And 172 children died. They did not die because someone chose to endanger them. They died because no one chose to protect them. Because protection requires something that standard practice does not demand. It requires imagination. It requires the willingness to picture the thing that has not happened yet, the fire that has not started, the crowd that has not formed, the door that has not jammed, and to design against it, to spend money on it, to disrupt the schedule for it, to look foolish for it if necessary, to prepare for a day that may never come, knowing that the preparation is what keeps it from coming. And imagination, in 1908, had not yet been applied to the places where America kept its children. That is what Collinwood is about. Not fire, not smoke, not a janitor who waited too long to raise the alarm, not a door that swung the wrong direction. Collinwood is about the distance between what we assume is safe and what is actually safe. The distance between the building we think we built and the building we actually built. The distance between the day we plan for and the day that arrives. 10 feet. From the vestibule to the open air. 10 feet. Some of those children could have reached out and touched it, could have felt the cold March wind on their fingers, could have seen the schoolyard, the street, the sky, the life that was waiting for them on the other side of a door that would not open. 10 feet. They died in a space smaller than a bedroom, inside a building their parents trusted, in a village that loved them, because no one, not one person, in 7 years, ever asked what would happen if everything went wrong at once. And by the time someone asked, the building had already answered. Thank you for staying until the end. This one was difficult to research. It was difficult to write. It was difficult to sit with the details of it, the specifics, the smallness of the space and the smallness of the bodies. But these are the stories that matter. These are the stories that sit beneath every safety feature we take for granted, beneath every fire drill we roll our eyes at, beneath every panic bar we press without thinking. They are the foundation, the cost. The reason the world is built the way it is, not because someone was clever, but because someone paid. I have a question for you, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer. The technology to prevent the Collinwood disaster already existed in 1908. Outward opening doors existed. Fire escapes existed. Fire drills had been proposed and practiced in other settings. The knowledge was there. The engineering was there. The solutions were there. The will wasn't. So here is the question. What safety measure do you think exists right now, today, as you watch this, that we are not applying? Something that is technically available, already proven, already understood, already within our reach, but that we are not requiring, not enforcing, not building into the systems and the buildings and the institutions that we depend on. Something that we will look back on after the next disaster, after the next investigation, after the next set of names on the next memorial and say, we knew, we had the solution. Why didn't we use it? What is our inward opening door? I'm asking because I think the answer exists. I think there are things we know right now, things we have the technology and the knowledge and the capability to fix right now, that we are not fixing, because it's expensive, because it's inconvenient, because it's never happened before, because the system works fine most days, because everything is standard. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, if it changed the way you look at a door, or a fire drill, or the exit sign above your head, then next I'm covering the disaster I mentioned earlier, the one that proved Collinwood's lesson had been forgotten. Our Lady of the Angels, Chicago, 1958, 92 children, 3 nuns, a school that met every building code on the books and burned anyway. 50 years after Collinwood, a new generation of children died for the same reasons. Open stairwells, no alarm connected to the fire department, no sprinklers, a building that was legal and inspected and approved, and that became a chimney the moment fire arrived. And here is the detail that makes that story unlike any other school fire in American history. The fire was almost certainly set deliberately. The prime suspect was 10 years old, a student at the school. That video is next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're new here, this channel covers historical disasters, overlooked catastrophes, and the moments where human systems failed. The warnings that were ignored. The reforms that arrived too late for the people who paid the price. The distance between what we assumed and what was real. Every story on this channel is about that distance. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.